F.E.A.R 2 Project Origin came out early 2009 as the sequel to F.E.A.R, which was released in 2005. Despite the name, this was the fourth installment in the series after the two expansion packs for the original F.E.A.R, Extraction Point and Perseus Mandate, both of which were developed by Timegate. So this was the second game developed by Monolith, who were known and still are for their innovation and creativity. Except when it comes to naming things apparently, because Project Origin was chosen by the public, winning over the other finalists, Dark Signal and Dead Echo. The original F.E.A.R was a smash hit, being applauded for its mysterious story and excellent lighting effects, but being made legend for its combat system. Your player character, the Point Man, was an action movie hero, capable of using grenades, a large variety of both fictional and conventional weaponry, and a series of martial arts melee attacks to take down the Replica. And it was those Replica that put the combat system so far above everything else. With simple but expertly implemented AI, players felt like they were going up against other players, not computers. But F.E.A.R wasn't perfect. Its story was a bit thin, its horror elements were a tad lacking, and its environments were washed out and boring. Well, straight away with F.E.A.R 2 you can see which of those issues was tackled head on. This game's graphics hold up 9 years later in 2018. It's still a looker, and it should be. F.E.A.R 1 was the crisis before crisis, so F.E.A.R 2 had a lot to live up to. Environments in this game are amazing. In fact, there's only one part of the entire game that I'd argue didn't look good. The skybox on the surface is green. Green or red skies are the laziest way to create an oppressive atmosphere in the world, and they destroy any sense of realism. That concludes my criticism. Everything else is stellar. The stylized apartment buildings of Interval 1 are a jarring contrast to anything we had from the previous 3 games. Color is actually present, and not just brown, with the yellows of the tram level and the deep watery blues of late Interval 5. The school level is particularly amazing. This place looks like a school, and the damage from explosions and gunfights look damn near realistic. It's great to see this from the series. Sadly though, F.E.A.R 2's graphics are awful. Sounds like a contradiction, but it isn't one. The environments might be great, but everything else? Yeah, no, they're not very good. No one played F.E.A.R 1 for the horror or for the story. People played it because it delivered an action FPS experience like no other. The things you could do in that game were glorious, taking badass to a new level. F.E.A.R 2 takes what made that experience look so good and systematically removes most of it. Not all, but most. Reflex mode is still here and it's still cool. Sound effects on shotguns are better, but everything else is gone or ruined. The physics engine that allowed for incredible over-the-top ragdoll effects is chained to the ground, making guns and melee attacks feel unimpactful and boring. Where I could once blow an enemy through a window with my shotgun, I can now just make them flop on the floor. You can see the difference between the two blood effects here. I like the old effects more because the new ones look like blobs, but clearly the new effects are more graphically impressive. Thing is, they tend to form a pool around bodies on the floor instead of flying all over the walls. I'm not looking at the floor, I'm looking at the walls. My eyes aren't where the effects are. Then consider the color. The new effects are much darker, which is an issue compounded on by the fact that the environments themselves are much darker than the original game. It gets worse. Your screen doesn't react to explosions anymore, making them feel far less powerful. Lights don't break in the same way, and the 3D parallax occlusion mapped bullet holes are gone. Remember the physics objects that exploded and scattered everywhere if hit by bullets or explosions? They're not gone, but they are reduced and overwhelmed. Particles seem to stick around for less time, but the problem is you can't even see them. I'm blaming that on 2 things: reflex mode and contrast. Reflex now has a much more present, shall we say, effect. Enemies glow in F.E.A.R 2, which can overwhelm the particle effects on screen. Some think this was stupid, but I think it's a necessary evil, because seeing where the enemies are is harder than ever, for the exact same reason seeing the particles is too. Contrast. There was a damn lot of white in F.E.A.R 1, in fact I'd call most of the environments whitewashed. If it wasn't white, you could bet it was very well lit thanks to the game's engine. The simplicity of the environments meant a lot of those colours were generally unbroken and covered large portions of the playspace. This meant that the bullet holes, the red mists, splatters of blood, and the other particle effects like sparks and papers contrasted against these bright, unbroken colours and made them stand out clearly. With F.E.A.R 2's environments, this is not the case, but the lighting is equally as responsible. According to John O'Rourke, a huge focus for F.E.A.R 2 was taking what made F.E.A.R 1's lighting great and pushing it to the next level. In F.E.A.R 2, the iconic rigid lighting is absent, so that clearly didn't go to plan. What can be praised is the soft shadows, which actually work now thanks to Condemned, and the real-time volumetric lighting, which made light react more realistically as it passed through certain objects. They traded what made F.E.A.R 1 special for an infinitely more generic experience. Think we're done? Not even close. Speaking of generic, enemies couldn't be more so, with the basic replica looking like paintballers, and everyone else being indistinguishable pulled from some random soldier man you'd see in every other game ever made. The HUD doesn't fit the game's atmosphere in the slightest. You have these giant blue bracket things constantly on screen which don't affect gameplay but are irritating nonetheless. The stylization of the icons looks like it belongs in Overwatch, not in a half horror game. Having these almost childish images on screen all the time I would say majorly detracts from the horror, the art, and the graphics, because they can't build an effective atmosphere when everything is filtered through this inappropriate lens. I would forgive not being as good as F.E.A.R because that's a high bar to reach, but this is F.E.A.R 2. Why would Monolith make something universally loved and totally unbroken worse? My guess is that they couldn't get both the combat effects and the environmental graphics running stably at the same time, and they were more interested in appealing to the COD-like shooter market than their own. F.E.A.R 2's performance isn't always butter on my modern mid-spec rig, so I imagine there were problems in 2009, but it pains me to think that they'd prioritize homogenizing F.E.A.R 2's look so it held up against everything else, instead of retaining their own identity and sticking with what made them so unique and loved. But I think it's true because sacrificing what made the first game special in favor of a more recognizable experience is going to show itself as a common denominator. Let's not waste any time before digging into the combat. This time around you're playing as Sergeant Michael Beckett, a silent protagonist. You spend interval 1 without reflex mode, but you're soon back in action after being subjected to some kind of procedure. Reflex is still here, and so are the classic martial arts melee attacks. With F.E.A.R 2's pitiful new physics, melee feels powerless, and so you'll never do it because you want to. As for the arsenal, we've kept frags and proximity grenades, but drop remote grenades in favor of shock and incendiary. Shocks can temporarily disable mechs, but only stun basic infantry, and incendiary is good against infantry but ineffective against armor. So there's some level of tactics to grenade selection, although the game never gives you any reason to use those types over the normal frag, other than for taking down mech shields, which you do about once. There's major balancing problems here. Sadly, grenades have lost their impact detonation, meaning you've just got to pray your throws will detonate near their targets, which is all down to luck of course since they bounce around like ping pong balls, making the use of grenades impractical at best. You can cook, which can negate these issues, but waiting around like a plum out in the open doesn't scream action FPS to me, especially given how quick you'll die doing that on hard, the only difficulty in which it's efficient to be using grenades. It's not worth bothering on normal. Either way, you're going to be relying on guns for the vast majority of your carnage in F.E.A.R 2, so it's good that the game provides you with 4 weapon slots, much higher than the norm for console shooters and 1 higher than F.E.A.R's typical 3. Keeping track of weapons like this can be hectic with numbers changing constantly, but ammo's well balanced for the number of slots, and this adds a much needed level of variation to the player's available weapons, given the sad state of the actual hardware we've got available. We've got a pistol, which looks ridiculous, and feels like it's firing Nerf darts with its pathetic sound effects and damage. You can't dual wield pistols in this game to make it even worse. The submachine gun is fine and does its job effectively, but thanks to how muted combat feels, it just makes me long for the previous iteration. The assault rifle is fully automatic, though it can have a semi-auto fire mode. It also has stats that make it superior to every other weapon all the time at every range other than very close and very far. It's insanely overpowered, and if you want an in-game easy mode, it's got you covered. The shotgun sounds amazing and looks that way too. It's got a satisfying punch, and that alone makes it one of the most enjoyable weapons in the game. The auto shotgun is like the shotgun, but automatic. Wait, no it isn't. It's still semi-auto. That's embarrassing. It has a higher range and rate of fire, but that doesn't explain why it's in the game. The hammerhead is like the penetrator, but its shots are blue. It sometimes sticks enemies to walls, and it's better against armor. Nothing special. The sniper rifle replaces the particle weapon and is better in every way. It's only a one-shot kill on the most basic of enemies, has a zoom that doesn't make me feel sick, is reasonably powered, and has incredibly satisfying kill effects. This gun feels like it belongs in F.E.A.R, and using it gave me some of the best memories I have from the game. As for power weapons, the missile launcher is like the multi-rocket launcher but more boring because it only fires a single shot. The laser rifle is like the laser carbine but more boring because it's only worth using at long to mid ranges and leaves no cool heat effect. And the pulse cannon is like the particle weapon but somehow, amazingly, even more boring because you don't even need to aim the giant insta-kill ball of death. The napalm is fun enough, but it's only viable in tight spaces and only against unarmored infantry. This makes it so rare that you could forget it's even in the game. Other than the missile launcher, which you can use against mechs, power weapons are useless. They just kill infantry quicker and easier than conventional weaponry. Conserving ammo for tougher enemies is a thing of the past, which takes away all excitement from finding or using them. So all in all, there was about 2 good weapons. They systematically made the power weapons less fun to use, and it seems like every conventional weapon in the game was stripped of its power, though that's something I can actually explain. John Mulkey, the lead designer, wanted to change how aiming works for F.E.A.R 2. Instead of zooming you in a little bit and bringing the gun up slightly higher, they were now going to go for full-on aim-down sights. When you go with F.E.A.R 1's approach, you often have these things called bullet tracers, where you can see the path of each bullet you fire. When you're firing automatic weapons, bullet tracers give you an idea of what you're shooting at and if you're landing your shots. But with ADS, you don't need them. You can instead just use hit markers or have very distinctive effects when a shot connects, which was also a quality of the first game. ADS and no bullet tracers is more familiar to the console market, and it also helps improve realism. But with F.E.A.R 2's giant ugly yellow hit markers, I don't really think that worked out. I also think this partly explains why guns in F.E.A.R 2 feel so powerless. When you're using ADS, you need to give guns better accuracy and less recoil, so the player can actually hit their target without their screens jerking about. And as a result, the guns feel more weightless. Add that to the fact that you can't see your gun, you can only see the sight, and that no bullet tracers means you can't even tell if anything's coming out of the barrel. Beyond graphics, ADS has further negative effects on the combat. ADSing slows your movement hugely, and since you need to be in it to compete at mid and long ranges, you'll end up barely moving in combat, if at all. Where F.E.A.R 1 had you permanently mobile thanks to the necessity of avoiding damage, F.E.A.R 2's ADS keeps you planted apart from at close range. So that wraps up why guns feel so much worse in F.E.A.R 2 compared to the original. But hey, it wasn't only firing the guns that made F.E.A.R's combat so good, it was the enemies you were firing them at, it was the AI. F.E.A.R 2's AI is derived from F.E.A.R 1's AI, so it's still great, right? Yes. The pathfinding is still top-notch, they still have voice lines for callouts and communication, though it seems like all of the personality has been sucked right out. Enemies will still throw grenades to flush you out, and most importantly, they still exhibit the fear of death that made the original AI so incredibly unique. For F.E.A.R 2, Monolith wanted to improve the AI's navigation system, and give them more opportunities to interact with the world, like running on walls, smashing through windows, etc. Not only are there more smart objects for the AI to move around as cover, but you can also move them too. In reality though, the AI will often walk into an exposed position to create cover because the animation to do so gives you easily enough time to gun them down, and being able to move cover yourself is utterly useless. With the introduction of incendiary grenades and the napalm weapon, enemies now react to being set on fire appropriately. As for the improved navigation, there's no detail on what that means. Overall though, F.E.A.R 2's AI is simply a more specialized version of what we got before. It's still F.E.A.R AI, yet almost all combat encounters feel radically different. I'm pinning that down to level design. Half of it's worse, half of it's different. Thankfully though, it's very easy to divide up. Intervals 1 to 3 were so boring that I thought I might slam my head into my keyboard, and intervals 4 to 6 were a blast. That's down to variation, but the original F.E.A.R was incredibly samey in terms of level design. What made its level design successful regardless was how the AI was able to use the template of rooms and corridors. Everything was relatively enclosed, but at its best, there was still a mix of engagement distances. There were multiple entrances to every room, be they doors or windows. There was a forest of objects for cover, and a maze of rooms and paths for the AI to hide in or to flank through. Sometimes there were multiple layers, only adding to the amount of space the AI had at their disposal. Sightlines were restricted, so you never knew for certain where and when a flank was coming from. Steve Gaynor, the guy who made the best levels in Perseus Mandate and went on to work on some big-name projects like Bioshock 2, wrote a blog post specifically referencing how F.E.A.R and F.E.A.R 2's level design is different. He defines a good FPS arena as having these 3 properties: varied, clustered cover, circular navigability, and observability. By clustered cover, he means that cover is spread out, but not evenly to avoid a flat experience, and so there's meaningful no man's land between each island of cover. Circular navigability effectively means flanking routes, which gives the player and AI movement options in almost every given space, and observability refers to a creative use of sightlines. From now on, this is how I define a good FPS arena, because I couldn't really have described why F.E.A.R 1's level design was so good that well if I was being paid to do it. I'll link the blog post down below. In F.E.A.R 2, you have basic rooms and basic corridors. There are few branching paths, and those that the the AI can use are almost never out of sight. Some arenas have a vertical layer or two if you're lucky, but those only show up in intervals 4 to 6 when the game gets good. Back in Gainer's blog post, he goes on to criticize F.E.A.R 2 for rarely allowing you the opportunity to sneak up on enemies. With enemies that are immediately aware of you, you're encouraged to play on the defensive near where you entered from and not get into the midst of the arena. Personally, I think this is true for the AI as much as it is for the player. You can, on multiple occasions, see that most of the enemy soldiers are coming from a single spot, and spray them down before they even get a chance to move in the play space. The simplicity of levels, the lack of F.E.A.R 1's labyrinthian arenas castrate F.E.A.R 2's enemies, and that in turn castrates the game. Here's why this is the case, and just before we start, I'm gonna thank DXFan619 for helping me understand the development of the game. He also has a F.E.A.R retrospective if you're interested. So, 2 new installments were being worked on. One was a sequel, another was a spin-off intended for console. The sequel team were the same guys who made the first game, except for John Mulkey and one other guy who was on the console project. Fast forward a bit and John Mulkey's gone. He went to work for id on Doom 4, which was then promptly cancelled for being too much like Call of Duty. This departure apparently occurred at the worst possible time, and to make matters worse, the sequel then gets cancelled. Moving forward again, and the original F.E.A.R team now join up with the console team in the last year of development. It was a bollock start final year, and so what you had in the end was your main designer, Mulkey, leave halfway through, resulting in less focus on a project that was already intended for console. So not only did they have a different design philosophy when designing for console, they also had a lack of direction when Mulkey left. But we still aren't finished. The third major problem with F.E.A.R 2's combat is that the game has a serious difficulty problem. Now this is very subjective, more so than everything else in the video, but I think that the jump in difficulty from normal to hard is simply astounding, and that that's going to affect everyone. I also think that normal is so easy that I could finish the game in a coma, and that hard is so irritating it makes me want to be in a coma. On normal, unless you're fairly new to FPS or maybe haven't played anything like F.E.A.R before, you're going to be able to walk through the first few intervals. Literally walk, as in you don't need to take your finger off the forward button because the enemies can't move properly or do anywhere near enough damage before you walk up to them, kill them, and make it to the next health pickup. Though this is so boring, I stop myself from doing it. On hard, the fire of every enemy is a considerable threat, and that's about what you want it. Thing is, in F.E.A.R 2 you can be easily one-shotted. This is mainly by shotgun replica, and I think it's a combination of the shotguns having less spread and the AI being more accurate. This is so random, unpredictable, and irritating that it makes you want to just turn the difficulty down and begin the cakewalk again. Unlike F.E.A.R 1, you only have 3 health packs, which creates a far more conservative attitude towards healing, so it's often better to die than it is to waste a precious medkit. That, or switch to the assault rifle of course. So you have to compromise. Do you want a boring game, or do you want a frustrating game? For me, there was no balance. And finally, the fourth problem with F.E.A.R 2's combat is that it does almost exactly what Perseus Mandate did during its mine and cloning facility levels, and it's the biggest reason that I did not enjoy my time with the back end of that game, or the first half of this game. Intervals 1 to 3 are boring, and that's because they're padded to hell and back. In F.E.A.R 1 and Extraction Point, you get from one plot point to another with a few creatively designed arenas and maybe a traversal puzzle in between. In F.E.A.R 2, there won't be a few creatively designed arenas. There'll be like one, and the rest will be corridors upon rooms upon rooms of enemies, health pickups, and random intel fragments. There's no creativity or flair to these arenas, it's just a shooting gallery. There's variation, but it's tiny, insignificant, and never builds on ideas. They'll throw in the easiest, most unimaginative traversal puzzles to break up combat for no reason at all. I don't want to have to turn a valve in some random room for no reason. If these puzzles were remotely creative as they were in F.E.A.R 1, then fine. but you can't pace out combat with something that doesn't engage you at all. Take the ending of Interval 3 when you're escaping to the surface. You get on an elevator after having cleared out a bunch of guys, then it stops and you have to turn some valves. And a few replica wake up. Why do I need to turn some valves and shoot 5 random guys? It's padding in its purest, undisguised form. After the second valve, you get attacked by a mech, and since that's a new enemy, cool. That's something new, that's something interesting. Now I don't feel like my time's being wasted. This is a good example of how not to do it and how it's done right in the same arena. I would argue that these first 3 intervals are the worst F.E.A.R has ever been, but the next 3 are actually very enjoyable. It's quite shocking just how quickly F.E.A.R 2 goes from bad to good, but I'll try to explain it as best I can. At this point, you've just made it to the surface, and for the first few sections it's more horror than combat, which I'll talk about later, but I'll say now that they efficiently introduced 2 new enemy types, both of whom were creatively designed and required different strategies to beat. As for the replica, they're now arranged in the exposed floors of buildings surrounding the streets, often on both sides at the same time. So you've got close engagement distances within the building itself, and long ones when dealing with the enemies across the street. There's enough cover for this not to be irritating, so it's a welcome and original level design idea for F.E.A.R. The replica's elite mech then crashes down into the street, forcing you to use the missile launchers lying around. They're put out of commission by these electrical hazards surrounding the area, and so are you. So after the mech goes down, you've got to carefully navigate your way around any electrified water. Moving on, you've got to help out Stokes, one of your teammates who's being pinned down by snipers. This is the first sniping section in the game, but the first well-designed sniping section in the series. This gun feels awesome to use. After the snipers die, an APC rocks up and you have to use the missile launcher to disable it. Then replica pour out the back and from all over, so you have an awesome fight in this multi-layered arena. Using the sniper close range feels amazing. Then, as if it needed to be better, you find a mech with no pilot. It took me a while to compute that they were going to let you have your own mech, but when I did, I was quite happy to say the least. Titanfall 2 is apparently a rip-off of F.E.A.R 2. This beast has turrets, thermal vision, and missile launchers to fight off the horde of replica coming your way. Yes, it's a power trip, not particularly challenging even on hard, because hard isn't challenging, it's just hard. And yes, the AI can't shine against a mech like this, but it's worth temporarily sacrificing that F.E.A.R sandbox to just go on a rampage for a few minutes. And it doesn't drag on, finishing with a face-off against multiple enemy mechs. I will say that they're a bit too easy. After you're out of the mech, you link back up with your team and get thrown right back into the horror. This level was absolutely great from a combat standpoint. The horror was creative and linked into the gameplay for the most part. Every arena had something unique about it, creating a varied and memorable experience. The new level design ideas were great, the new sniper is awesome, and piloting a mech is amazing. Creativity and variation breathe new life into tired FPS combat. Extraction Point proved it, Perseus Mandate in this game proved how awful it is without it. Though the level design only once allows the AI to shine, in that sniping section, whereas all of Extraction Point's design was very clearly built around the AI. It's 2 different ways of doing variation, and we can see that F.E.A.R 2 took the more conventional route. To highlight a few more good arenas from the later half, we simply can't ignore the tram station level. This arena contains easily the best sniping section in the entire game, with enemies coming from everywhere, on 3 layers in this hulk of a battleground. That's very much overshadowed by what you get when you're actually on the tram. As you're moving, the replicas start waking up on your car, so you have to fight them. Then another tram pulls up with more replica, then their tram hovers over yours, then half of their tram replaces half of yours, and then you crash into a wall. It's pretty hectic, but it's made so enjoyable by the mix of engagement distances that constantly changes the tram car's shift. Sadly, the late game doesn't hold up this degree of quality all throughout. It goes back to its old tricks late Interval 5 in this underground facility, filled with, you guessed it, rooms and corridors, closer to those in the early game than F.E.A.R 1. Early Interval 6 does the same thing with only a bit more variation in this subway arena. I'll at least admit that this was a cool new look for subways in F.E.A.R. Mid-Interval 6 literally just redoes Interval 4. There are also 2 turret sections, one of which is barely above mind-numbing thanks to the story context, and the other is backed by hard rock with vocals and everything. What in God's name were they thinking with this? I like that it's there, but it's a bit inappropriate for the bits leading up to the climax of the game. Overall, I think F.E.A.R 2 is worth a playthrough if you like FPS. It's not a bad experience, but I can't say that the gameplay is better than even Perseus Mandate, because what made the first game special is just gone. We have a higher variety of vertical and open arenas. We have weapons that work in those spaces like the AR and the sniper, so you aren't cream crackered the moment you leave the tight areas. I can praise the game for that, and it is high praise, but the combat combat effects are gone. The AI is castrated thanks to boring, simplistic level design, which also kills replay value. Your weaponry is pathetic. Complaints from the first game have been addressed. Overall, F.E.A.R 2 does have more variation than F.E.A.R 1. It's a shame it had to sell its soul along the way. Speaking of souls, F.E.A.R 2 has a story, and for the first time I'm actually glad that it does. It's still not great, but it's easily the strongest story we've had so far. So, you play as Michael Beckett, a sergeant working for Delta Force. Your teammates are Jankowski, the brother of the other Jankowski and a massive arsehole, Morales, who's a hothead, Fox, Griffin, Keegan, and Stokes. Yeah, that's the best I could do with describing the personalities. Those who I didn't describe don't really have any. That's mainly down to screen time. You're still on your own for almost all of the combat. There are 6 other members of your squad, and the game is about 7 hours long. So as you can imagine, there's not much room for character development. It's only Stokes, Keegan, and Morales who have any presence in the story. It's only Stokes who you'll have any bond to by the end, which is thanks to screen time and Jen Taylor's excellent voice acting. It seemed to me that Jankowski was there just to be the obligatory arsehole, and Fox and Griffin were just there to die. So this isn't exactly Mass Effect, but any level of bond to your teammates is better than what the first game offered, and I'll take what I can get. It also has to be said that the dialogue is very well written. And apart from Jankowski, pretty much every character felt real. I'd say that this is easily one of the story's strongest aspects, but the plot's where things get really interesting. Your Delta Force squad is on its way to arrest Genevieve Aristide, the CEO of Armacam, when you're attacked by ATC. They're no longer under Aristide's control, and now answer to the board of directors who want her dead to stop her from talking. You save her and then can learn from these intel pickups that there's something called Project Harbinger, and that you and your team are a part of it. Later intel pickups reveal that Harbinger was about creating psychic commanders like Paxton without the use of Alma. Many of your team are possible candidates for that because you have psychic abilities. You're also codenamed Dark Signal. The game doesn't make any of this clear. Genevieve tells you that you're the only way to stop Alma, and then the vault from F.E.A.R 1 explodes. The next thing you see is being loaded onto a helicopter and then having some kind of experiment performed on you. Aristide oversees the operation, but Alma shows up multiple times. When you wake up, you've got reflex mode. The rest of your team are trapped in the same facility, but Jankowski didn't survive. Those ATC Black Ops guys came back, and you're introduced to their leader, Colonel Vanek. He's your classic shouty arsehole drill sergeant type and an extremely boring character. Fighting your way through them, you get a call from Snake Fist, an anonymous hacker type guy, and he explains that Alma is trying to absorb you because you emit psychic energy after the operation.
You're like free pizza at an anime convention. She can smell you, and she wants to consume you.
This is supposed to be the explanation for the press queue to stop being sexually harassed by the Demon Lady minigames. You'll also encounter some ugly abominations. These guys are meant to be the failed psychic commanders. You get to see what kind of experiments they're subjected to, which is a great touch. Later, they're used to reactivate the replica, who you fight in a training arena. But if these guys are insane, then why do the replica act as they did under Paxton's control? And why, when Alma shows up to murder the commander, do the replica remain active and dangerous? The game tries to explain it away with Alma's close proximity, but that makes no sense, because she doesn't want to kill you. She wants to absorb you, and later in the game she even wants more. And if her will is irrelevant because she can't control her psychic powers, why are the replica still a coordinated military? And if the replica don't need specific commands to function, then what's the point in psychic control in the first place? Why not have clone commanders who you can control via internet or Wi-Fi or something? The best explanation I can come up with is that she doesn't want to stop them from trying to kill you, because that would imply that she's leading you into a trap. But I think that's a bit of a stretch. I wanted the replica back, but I don't think this was a good way of doing it. Soon after, you head up to the surface and learn from Snakefist that he and Genevieve are held up at Wade Elementary. You head there with Stokes and eventually find yourself in a chokehold, but this time Alma's no longer ugly. She screams why when you push her away. I think this is a pretty creative way of giving away what Alma's motives are. You later find this secret facility underground. This entire school is a front for Armacam's Project Paragon, which is useless to the plot and totally irrelevant, so the care put into this place seems wasted. Paragon was about making Harbinger candidates from children, and after reading all the intel, you can learn about the testing procedures, the complications, and the results. It's actually very good world building. Perhaps more people would have seen that if the intel wasn't presented in text boxes. Deeper in this facility, Aristide is gone, but Snakefist and Vanek aren't. You shoot Vanek in the head after a button mashing event, real climactic. You then meet Snakefist in person. He explains in a very odd cutscene that you've got to destroy Alma to stop her from absorbing you, and that you can do so in a psychic amplifier in a nuclear reactor. Then his head falls off. So you go over to this amplifier all while Keegan goes mental. He seems to be having the same reactions to Alma that you do. You strap yourself into the amplifier after a wild Keegan chase, but then Genevieve shows back up and shoots Stokes in the stomach. Apparently that procedure was about turning you into a lure for Alma. She first says she's doing this so she can seal Alma and Beckett inside this vault-like containment ball for leverage against Armacam, which she then contradicts by saying that she has no choice, even though she clearly does. Perhaps this was intentional to suggest that Genevieve is trying and failing to convince herself that what she's doing is right. Alma appears as Genevieve predicted, and you're transported to this field. This field has been a recurring image throughout the game. You've gone there in visions multiple times, and you found the real-life representation of it near the reactor. It's a place of significance for Alma. You can see the containment timer in the grass, and it's turning rapidly along with the sky, implying that time is moving incredibly fast. Keegan is here and he teleports around trying to kill you. Your objective is to get to a console and press a button. Each time, Keegan asks why she wants you and not him. While you fight Keegan, Alma rapes you, violently. You then kill Keegan, press a few buttons, and get a cutscene of Alma, now pregnant. She places your hand on her stomach, and the game ends. This was a great final boss from a story perspective, not so much from the gameplay side of things. All you need to do is press a few buttons and do a quick time event. So after Alma went from ugly to not ugly, she wanted to have sex with you, which is why she screamed upon rejection. I'm guessing she wanted you because you're the most psychic of all the psychics, and Keegan was second best. Griffin was killed because he wasn't good enough. Genevieve got what she wanted, trapping you in this container with Alma for leverage. She doesn't know, of course, that Alma spent all that time locked away raping you and getting pregnant with Antichrist 2, this time it's personal. That was a pretty good story. Usually I'd now take this time to explain why things don't make sense and it's all just context for the horror. But honestly, I can't. Everything in this game makes sense. Alma is actually an extremely intelligent and well-written villain. I might not have given off that impression from my story summary, and that's going to be important later, but for now let me just explain myself. So your squad is psychic and Alma wants to have a kid. The most psychic out of all of you is Beckett, and the second most psychic is Keegan. Stokes and Morales aren't psychic, because one's a driver and one's a comms officer. Stokes isn't even technically part of the team at all. When the lot of you are subjected to psychic attunement operations under Genevieve's command, you see Alma there. She's the one stopping the operation from failing. Genevieve thinks she's playing Alma by turning you and your team into lures for her, but Alma wants this. As you go along, Alma kills Griffin and Fox. Griffin is killed because he's not as good as you or Keegan, and Fox is killed because his daughter is the same age as Alma when she was put into a coma, which triggers her so-called daddy issues. Stokes and Morales don't die because they aren't psychic, and so Alma pays them no attention. As for Keegan, Alma is using him as a lure for you. You'd naturally want to follow your lost teammate more than you would Alma herself. She's actually had him in her pocket from the very beginning. Notice that Keegan is having headaches even when Stokes is giving her exposition dump. Alma needs him because she wants you, but you've repeatedly shown that you're capable of resisting her. That's backed up in lore with your outstanding mental stability on Dr. York's tests. Then at the end, Alma's using his psychic signature as a way of keeping you subdued while she rapes you. He hates that his life was wasted as nothing more than a lure, which is why he hates you and pretty much asks you to do it in the final QuickTime event. Now we'll look at some recurring imagery. The opening level is called Premonition, and when you look at the sky, you'll notice it's experiencing time far faster than you are, just as is true in the rape ball. Alma knows you're psychic, so she uses these things as a way of getting you where she wants you, although I think this first attempt was more her trying to absorb you. You'll regularly see this image, a dead tree, but in a beautiful white field with Alma happily swinging on it, although sometimes the swing is empty. It's presented as beautiful, through the grass that doesn't seem to end and the tranquil dreamlike white background. It's the first image you'll see, and it burning is the last arena you'll ever find yourself in. As the game progresses, you'll see the field seemingly on fire, and it all comes together when you finally make it there yourself. It's here. The tree is dead and the grass is thin, because this is next to a nuclear reactor. There is no field. The white background is just what Alma wants it to be. Then, when you see the flames, it becomes clear that Alma associates hatred and rage with this place just as much as happiness, because this was the last place she ever saw sunlight. She's using this image as a lure for you, because the containment device she wants you in is right next to it. It's further evidence that she wants you seeing this image by the fact that if you turn around during any of these sections, she's there watching you. This game has a lot of hidden depth. The foreshadowing is top notch, and everything that happens makes sense. It's great stuff, but do you know how I know all this? thinking about the story for about 2 days after reading the wiki, the intel, and having a 3-hour conversation with DXFan619. If you want to have a clue why the things that are happening, you need to be studying the intel pickups. The game doesn't even explicitly tell you that your squad is psychic. I didn't even know that the name of our team was Dark Signal until I researched it. Now, this isn't bad. Researching isn't bad, lore isn't bad, and you can get by without the intel. But to achieve a satisfying level of understanding, I think that their use is quite necessary. A defense of this might be that you needed to research the story, be it in-game or out, in the Souls series and in F.E.A.R 1, so it's hypocritical to praise them for taking this approach if you criticize F.E.A.R 2 for doing the same. There are 3 reasons why I think this defense isn't solid. A, because this is an action FPS. Slowing down the gameplay for intel isn't a good idea, not even as pacing, since the shift is so jarring. Unlike F.E.A.R 1, where you only had to press a button to get the lore to play for you. You could tap the laptop and then walk off. The answering machines just required you to be in the vicinity. In F.E.A.R 2, you need to pause the game. B, item descriptions are only a part of the lore among dialogue and environmental storytelling in the Soul series. Here, it's 90% intel text with few exceptions. And C, unlike a classic story, you can't just accept some of the things that happen in this game. The fact that they happen when and where they do automatically raises questions that you feel the urge to answer, which inevitably leads to disappointment when all of those questions go unanswered if you didn't read the text boxes. F.E.A.R 2 kills off Griffin and Fox without developing their characters in the slightest. And the thing is, it makes sense for Alma to kill them when and how she does, but knowing why doesn't excuse killing characters pointlessly. These characters clearly should have had a bigger spotlight. Dramatic tension shouldn't have been removed by that stupid-ass rock song near the end, despite it making sense for Morales' personality. Snakefist shouldn't have been killed just because the story couldn't be asked to deal with him anymore. To boil the problem down, the unsuccessful writing decisions in the game raises questions that can only be answered with intel. So all in all, F.E.A.R 2 has a very good story. The problem is how it's told. Either way, I do think it's an effective narrative with or without the intel, and that F.E.A.R 2's increased focus on the narrative aspect was a resounding success. So this is supposed to be the part where I say that the story is nothing more than context for the horror, but that's not the case here. So, let's just talk about the horror. F.E.A.R 2's horror is easy to segment. You've got Alma, who isn't scary in the slightest, and everything else, all of which is at the very least competent. But let's get Alma out of the way first. She sometimes randomly blinks around in front of you. She does this for the entire game. The strongest fear is the fear of the unknown. And so if your horror isn't varied, if it's even remotely predictable, it all goes down the drain. Every time your screen goes all fuzzy and Alma starts popping up everywhere, it does nothing. Sometimes she tries to sexually harass you, but these, 9 times out of 10, are predictable as hell, and only require you to mash a button. It just feels like walking down the street as Channing Tatum, but without the ego boost, because Alma's a demon witch and that. But it's not all doom and gloom. In my first video, I said that what F.E.A.R needed was less scripted, cheap nonsense, and more stuff that linked the combat and the horror together, because this is the only way to justify putting horror in an action FPS. F.E.A.R 1 did this once with the replica assassins, F.E.A.R Perseus Mandate did this once again with the giant mech chase, and F.E.A.R 2 does it all the time, but not always as well. There are 3 new horror type enemies for you to fight in this game. The first ones you'll encounter are the Abominations, and sadly they live up to their names. They crawl about and hit you up close like the replica assassins. They die in 1 or 2 shotgun blasts, don't go invisible, aren't that fast, and give away their positions with dog-like noises. So as soon as you learn to use reflex mode, it's like killing fleas. If they were actually scary, I might forgive that, but they're just ugly creatures scuttling about in perfect light. Getting better, in Interval 4 we first encounter the Remnants. They're basically fat demon guys who run about, have an insane amount of health, and can resurrect the dead. They're like Mercy, but the demon version, and extremely ugly. They usually bring back a regular ATC guy who you can easily kill. It's also worth noting how good the effects are on the undead, looking as if they're actually being puppeteered, and how cool the raising filter is. The dudes themselves take so much damage that they'll be able to bring back the same dead guys at least twice in the battle, which is a very odd but creative way of doing things. This is a bizarre battle, but it's new, it's varied, and it's welcome. What it isn't is particularly scary, but it's much better than the Abominations, and the ghosts certainly have the fear factor covered. Yeah, ghosts. For a game called F.E.A.R, you'd think there'd be more ghosts, apart from Alma of course. These guys look as if they're shuddering between dimensions as they stand still in corners corners waiting. When you approach, they burst out. They also often dart about in front of you. They're not too tough, but there's always plenty of them. And the way they move in these low-light areas can genuinely be terrifying, as Interval 5 proves. There's this horror section in Interval 5 that makes the shades from Extraction Point look like teddy bears. It's the first time, in my opinion, that the series has managed to create genuine and intense horror. You're walking down a school corridor, and there's already been plenty of spooky stuff beforehand, so you're certainly primed. This corridor is dimly lit, which highlights the incredible visual effects on the ghosts that are going to burst out at you. There are multiple ghosts down the first corridor, most of them dip and hide in the adjacent rooms. Making your way down the second corridor, the locker doors suddenly swing open like dominoes, and a few paces after, well, just watch this. So not only are the lights blinking all over the place, but the ghosts are attacking with their incredible animations. There's blood everywhere, and Alma teleports in and out of the arena every few seconds. I'm pretty sure that the teleporting is dynamic too, which is very impressive, but then it gets even better. After you make it out of this hellhole, you walk down another corridor, and this time there's color and everything seems to have gone back to normal. But all of a sudden, Alma does her surprise sexual harassment attack, and this time it's actually effective, because the game has you under the impression that the horror's over by then. All of Interval 5 exemplifies the best horror the series has ever seen. It's great. Later on in the same mission, you'll be introduced to the replica assassins again. This time their design is a little more intimidating, and instead of just going invisible, they seem to be outfitted with reflective panels that actually react to damage. Their AI has also undergone multiple improvements, such as clearly more fluid navigation, a shock punch attack instead of a simple swipe, and a much more distinct fear of death. You aim your gun at them, they will often roll out of the way. This makes them harder to land headshots on, but once again, it's not hard to just spray them down or simply use the bicycle kick once in range. They still have far too little health, and never have the aid of a dark or dim setting in this game. Another problem is their introduction. The first time you see them is when one cuts Snakefist's head off, but the problem is, this is in a cutscene, and it was also blatantly obvious that Snakefist was going to die. So there's no jump effect on the introduction, which I thought was missed potential. And that's about it, which really is my biggest criticism of the horror. Monolith clearly knew what they were doing for F.E.A.R 2, yet the majority of the horror sequences in the game are visions, which aren't scary, or attempted rape, which in the context of the game also isn't scary. The abominations were more irritating than horrific, leaving only the assassins, which were stripped of their jump effect, the remnants, which are good, and the ghosts, which were great. About half of Interval 5 was horror. The proportion is vastly lower in every other interval, meaning other than Perseus' Mandate, F.E.A.R 2 has the lowest combat to horror ratio of any F.E.A.R thus far. Monolith had what they needed, they just didn't seem to capitalize on it, as Interval 5 proved they were capable of. Is F.E.A.R 2 worth a playthrough for fans of horror games? I think yes, absolutely. Horror FPS is a pretty niche genre, and I think F.E.A.R 2 helped justify its existence. And with horror done, I don't really have anything left to talk about. F.E.A.R 2 Reborn was released as DLC the next year. I would have covered it in this video, but I don't think it needed to be any longer. So Reborn will have its own video. F.E.A.R 2 had a reportedly unremarkable multiplayer, but since GameSpy's closure, it's gone on PC and is as good as dead on console. So I couldn't test it even if I wanted to. F.E.A.R consists of 3 pillars as far as I'm concerned, those being combat, story, and horror. I think everyone plays for their own reasons, and weigh the importance of each up differently, which is why I think F.E.A.R 2 is by a landslide the most controversial game in the franchise. Where F.E.A.R 1 is adored and F.E.A.R 3 is despised, 2 is dismissed by some and loved by others. I think that's because 2's successes and failures had totally different impacts on everyone who played it. Where F.E.A.R 2 is unquestionably weaker in combat, it's far stronger in story and horror. So those who loved the combat of F.E.A.R 1 would find F.E.A.R 2 a massive disappointment, but those who felt F.E.A.R 1's fleeting story and lackluster horror were big issues would have been pleasantly surprised by 2. I also think that there's yet another layer of conflict in platforms. Where F.E.A.R 1 was predominantly played and had its community based on PC, F.E.A.R 2 was designed for console, and was more than likely the entry point for a huge amount of F.E.A.R fans today. If you played F.E.A.R 1 first, you might have gotten used to its design, fine, and disliked 2's lack of what made F.E.A.R. 1 special. But if you started with F.E.A.R. 2, you might have loved it for its story and effective horror, and found F.E.A.R. 1 not to live up to the hype. No one here is right or wrong, it's all a matter of perspective, but I don't think there had to be any controversy at all. If Monolith hadn't screwed up the combat so royally, if Monolith hadn't very consciously abandoned what people loved about the first for very little benefit at all, F.E.A.R. 2 is a solid FPS and absolutely worth a playthrough, though since I think F.E.A.R.'s ace was always its combat, it is in my opinion inferior to the first game. I hope you'll be able to decide for yourself more easily now that we've been through it, and I hope everyone enjoyed this retrospective. F.E.A.R. 2 Reborn will be the next video in the series, of course followed by F.E.A.R. 3. I don't know if these will be the next videos on the channel though. I'd like to either make a special or an update video to explain what's going to be happening to my channel over the next year, but since I want to soft launch my new Patreon in this video, I'm going to disclose everything important now. From now until mid-June, I won't be able to maintain my current rate of uploads, because I need to shift my focus. So the best way I see of handling that is by using the time I do have to make shorter videos, which is good because I'd usually never get around to doing those. Reborn will likely be one of them. When I'm again able to put everything I have into YouTube, I'll come back with a bang. I plan on doing this for as long as I can, which leads me onto the Patreon. A few people had asked for this and I've been sitting on it for a little while, so I figured this would be a good place to announce it. As always, it's completely optional. This is just to help support the channel, and by no means an obligation. As for the page itself, there's a wall of text about how everything works, and a few reward tiers at the side. There's going to be a credit slide from now on, which has the names of all the patrons with a different brightness level depending on the reward tier. I know that's corny, but hey, you'll never shine if you don't glow. There's also Discord roles, scripts, notes, thumbnails, and a Q&A that I'm going to start doing. Being a patron gets you a guaranteed question in the Q&A, but you can still ask stuff wherever and whenever you want. I'll still try to answer. Thank you for watching, and thanks again to DXFan619 for helping me understand the development and story of this game.